Welcome to Sounding Out, the podcast which gives musicians the chance to speak about what really matters to them. I'm delighted to say for episode 1 of this podcast, we've got Samrat Majumder, an absolutely fantastic Scottish guitarist. I think he's speaking to us from Germany, where he's doing some postgraduate study. But he's going to be talking to us about some fascinating stuff involving the sort of crossover or attempt to find connections between his instrument, the classical guitar, and in Indian music. So it's going to be really fascinating, not a subject that I'd really even given much thought to before. I'm really excited to hear all about it. So Samrat, welcome. It's great to have you on. I'm a big fan of yours, and we first met when you were at the Junior Conservatoire in
Yes, that's right.
Glasgow, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, the junior. You went on to the senior school, of course, to do your bachelor's. But
Yes.
if I can just tell the story of when I first heard you, for some strange reason, not sure why, maybe nobody else was available, I was asked to adjudicate the competition, the annual Junior Conservatoire guitar competition. And you played. It was absolutely fantastic. It was so impressive. But I remember at the time, you were much younger than a lot of the other competitors, and you were maybe a couple of kind of notches down on the grade scale, as it were. I don't know what you would. You were maybe doing grade 5, and a lot of the others were doing maybe grade 7. And I remember being left with this dilemma because you played the best, and there was just no question about it. It was very polished. It was musical. There was phrasing. It was a good sound. But there were other people who were kind of officially more advanced than you, but they just didn't play as well. And I didn't know quite what to do. But in the end, I decided to give you first prize, and which is a decision I've never regretted, I have to say. But it was even funnier because they asked me to come back the next year, and the competition was on, and here you were again competing. But well, now you were playing all the same level of stuff as everybody else, as advanced, but you still played the best, so you got the first prize again. For some reason, I was never asked back. And I don't know, I don't know. They suspected you were giving me backhanders or something. But anyway, sorry, I'm not going to dominate the conversation from now on. But I thought that's a lovely story to tell, and you've just gone from strength to strength, and we're going to hear a little bit of your playing actually from YouTube during the podcast. But before getting into the topic of this fascinating research you're doing into the guitar in India, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background? How you got into music. Just start from the beginning or wherever you want to start.
Sure. So thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk with you, a musician I admire greatly as well. And so I started at the age of around maybe 6 or 7, doing it in school as a kind of after-school activity in that capacity. And it was my parents, my mom and my dad, who were really passionate about music. Neither of them are musicians professionally, but they're music lovers. And they guided me towards trying to take the guitar, not just as a hobby, but something seriously. And when I was at the age of around 10 or 11, then they put me into the audition for the Junior Conservatoire, as you mentioned. And then I started studying with a teacher there, Peter Stewart. And he was the one that really opened up the classical guitar world to me and showed me that it's not just a hobby. It's not just an instrument that can be played on a Saturday evening when everybody's come back from their 9-to-5s. There's a whole world to it. There's a whole culture, a whole set of cultures to it. Mm-hmm. And he really ignited the passion in me. And so when I was coming to the age of 18, for me, because of that kind of, I'd gone to an academic school, so everybody else was doing academic subjects and aspiring towards academic careers. And I kind of felt the peer pressure of that and thought, okay, maybe I should do medicine. But I always had the idea, I'll do medicine and music. And the voices that I had from other people were, well, it's not really possible. It is possible, but you won't be happy with whatever level you get to with both, because it takes away so much time. And for me, I just couldn't see myself without music. So it had to be music. And even my dad, who was a doctor himself, said that he didn't see the drive that I had for music in medicine. So he was the final push that said guitar is the thing to do. But then I went to study at the Royal Conservatoire under Professor Alan Neve, fantastic teacher. And that was where I really started to, I was still in awe of the instrument. During my junior years, I was just absolutely head over heels, they say, with music. And then these 4 years with Professor Neve, I understood how to become a sort of working professional in the way that he not only made music, but also treated people. It's not just about becoming a good musician, but it's also about pairing that with how to become a social and amicable person as well. And then finally, after my 4 years there, I went to study with Professor Enno Voorhorst at The Hague for 2 years. And those were wonderful 2 years. Enno is just such a natural musician. He has a very sincere and gentle personality, and that comes across in his playing. And that's something that I really enjoyed learning from, is his approach to music and his approach to life, in the way that he makes everything work. It all makes sense. There's nothing abstract. There's nothing show-offy. There's nothing virtuosic for the sake of being virtuosic. It's purely musical with a historical understanding of where the music is coming from, and a cultural understanding as well. And having finished that, I enjoyed my time in Europe so much that I wanted to stay a little longer. So I applied for the concert examen in Düsseldorf, because despite enjoying the Netherlands so much, in fact, it was the perfect place for me to start in Europe. And I would say it's the perfect place for any English speaker to start in Europe, because the culture is so adapted to English. There's Dutch, of course, but everybody speaks a very, very high level of English anyway. So I got around by learning very, very little Dutch. And so when I finished there, I thought, okay, I've made great, great friends, and I've developed a wonderful relationship with the professor, but I don't feel like I've immersed myself in the culture. So Germany was right next door, and I heard from many people, and I was inspired whenever I go to these festivals in Germany, all these international players coming, and then after whatever competition or concert, they would come to a bar or something and all speak to one another in German, somebody from South Korea, somebody from Australia, somebody from Italy, and they'd all have learned German and speaking German at a very high level. I mean, we take this for granted perhaps because we're coming from an English-speaking part of the world, but when people come to, I don't know, America or Britain, it's amazing that they pick up the language such that they can express themselves in it. And so I wanted to push myself in that direction. I wouldn't say it's a success yet. I'm still, tripling over things, and the bureaucracy is quite difficult to navigate around, but it's certainly worthwhile. For example, because so much of the music that we play is from German speaking parts of the world, Austria and Germany, an understanding of the language gives another understanding to the interpretation of music from these areas. So I'm studying at the moment with Professor Alexander Ramirez, another wonderful teacher, and I just started in October, so it's been almost 5 months or something. And what I'm learning from him is a different approach to music interpretation, but also the technique in a different approach in the terms of the way in which one strikes the string. It's a much more Segovian approach to how you would produce sound. There's more emphasis on weight of the finger on the string and understanding vibrato in a different way. So just looking more into detail and more into the philosophy of certain musical techniques that will give a different voice to interpretations of different periods of music.
That's wonderful. It sounds great, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really good. The thing that I sort of was thinking about there was that you had the importance of supportive parents as the first thing that really came out of what you said,
Yeah,
and it's wonderful that you have it's wonderful that you recognize it uh,
yeah,
in the way that you do. It's quite easy to forget and we can kind of take it for granted, but also that the wisdom of your dad there in being a doctor himself, but he was able to see where your heart was. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, it's very special.
I
Uh,
still remember that conversation. It was it was a complete revelation, you know.
yeah, yeah. No, great, great. In terms of your studies, what jumps out at me is that you landed with the right teachers at the right stages, if that makes sense. Um,
Yes.
they've been the right people for for to give you what you required at that particular time. I mean, Peter Stewart, obviously know well. He's very detailed on foundational technique.
Mhm.
I mean, it makes him such a wonderful asset to the junior conservatoire in
100%.
in that way. So giving you that formation, and then Alan, of course, is he's just wonderful on on so many levels.
Yes.
I mean, in terms of doubling down on technique, of taking it further, building on those foundations, but also as a sophisticated musician,
Mm.
which of course, which Peter is as well. I don't want to suggest that he isn't that in any way, but
Mhm.
but then of course, and you having the courage to go elsewhere, being very grateful and recognizing how much you got out of studying with those people. I think you had the kind of wisdom, foresight, to to know that, well, getting something else
Mhm.
from somewhere else is so important. And it sounds like that's really worked out. It sounds like they've just, as I said, given you what you needed at that particular time, which is wonderful. It's really great.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it kind of you're absolutely right. Every teacher, every individual that I've had is been uh, uh, a blessing, and yet what I find is there's one thing perhaps in common with all of them, whether that be my parents or the different teachers that I've had, and it's that they've always, and not just myself, but the way in which they treat other people is they've always wanted the best for other people, in the sense that they know they're not the possessive type where they're like, okay, you're my student or you're my child or something like this. It's kind of like, okay, you have to become something. Here's the stage where I've been with you. Now go somewhere else, and that's always a a virtue in somebody that is teaching, that they allow the bird to go from the nest and make its own failures or its own successes, depending on whatever direction it goes in.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Actually, I really couldn't agree more.
Mm,
Okay, well, that's great. I mean, that's all. That's a wonderful introduction, Samrat.
thank
So,
you.
if we could get into this fascinating and quite unique um, research you've been carrying out. You sent me some of the stuff that you were that you've been looking into. Um, it was called an investigation of Eastern cultural influences in the classical guitar solo repertoire. A little bit of a
Yes.
mouthful, but well, maybe you need to pick it apart for for me and for anyone listening. I mean, firstly, what drew you to that topic?
So, I mean, this is a topic that has a personal level to it because my family and my background is from India. Growing up, of course, I was so enamored of the classical guitar, but then when I would go to India, the environment would be totally different. The appreciation that you and I see in Scotland for the classical guitar or in Europe isn't the same in India, at least in the environments that I was growing up in when I would go to India. So the two worlds seemed kind of um, basically worlds apart. And what I was thinking was when I was going through higher education, I thought, well, how is it that I could connect the two so that, because it's not just that the classical guitar or the Western classical guitar is for Western audiences, it's for human audiences, it's for everybody. There's beauty in everything that is presented from any art form. And so I looked into the position of the Western classical guitar in India, and I was really impressed to find that there were some festivals that were happening at the time in Kolkata. And this will lead on to other things that I did in India or I'm doing in India. But also the other thing that I saw was, we see today in global classical guitar festivals, people coming from all over the world. People coming from, of course, South America, North America, Europe, and also parts of Asia, such as China, Korea, Japan, um, and India as well. And what I thought was, usually, like the main example I have in my head is Barrios. I think what Barrios did was unbelievable. He single-handedly almost brought Paraguayan culture into the mainstream canon of the classical guitar. It wasn't just that he was a virtuoso. He brought with him, through his compositions and through this alter ego that he had of Nitsuga Mangore, this idea of presenting Paraguayan culture to the classical guitar world. And now, any classical guitarist will have heard the name Barrios and will have at least some basic knowledge about Paraguayan culture if you are studying his works deeply. And so I thought, well, in the East, I see that there's a great opportunity for others to do so in the same way. And already that's starting to happen. For example, with Japan, there's been a great deal of work already in the early 20th century, in the late 20th century with Toru Takemitsu, bringing Japanese elements, whether that be philosophy, whether that be art, into the classical guitar world. I mean, for example, you look at the works of Folios or In the Woods, an understanding of his philosophy about the Japanese garden, which is a part of Japanese culture, enhances the experience of interpreting and listening to those works. And so my research is looking at how we can incorporate other elements of Eastern cultures into the mainstream classical guitar canon, because one of the um, one of the misconceptions that I don't want to pursue is, perhaps this is quite controversial, but something that I feel is that every progressive um, ideal sometimes comes at the expense of something else. What I don't want to say is that we need to bring in more Eastern cultures and less of the Western. That's not at all what I'm going for. I'm going for enriching it as a whole, keep the influences from the West coming, and also start a kind of, um, a trail of different Eastern cultures coming into that already impregnated source of different cultures in the classical guitar world.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. Because of course India has such a rich um, uh, musical tradition. I mean, a very, very serious,
Yes.
almost all-encompassing musical tradition and culture genre, if you like. I mean, lots of genres within it as well. Um, Now, I'm thinking well, as you're describing that, the one guitarist that actually sprung to mind was John McLaughlin,
Mhm.
the great jazz guitarist who um, who sort of attempted to, and I mean, I say attempted to just because it's not my area of expertise, so I don't I don't want to give a judgment on it. But I think many people would say very, very successfully integrated
Mhm.
and absorbed elements of Indian music in his, I don't know, it's almost a genre of its own, or his
Yeah.
jazz fusion, if you like. You know, the modes, the rhythms, the I mean, he made quite a big thing of it. Is he a figure that that inspired you in any way, or that you look up to, or?
You know, it's interesting. I'd heard of John McLaughlin, but I'd never heard of this project that he'd done. And it's
Mhm.
something that I'm going to definitely be looking into because it sounds fascinating. Um, what's interesting about this topic is, on a personal level, I am in awe of Indian music, but perhaps it I don't find the same connection with it as I do with Western classical music, in the sense of it's not a music that I regularly listen to. Um, and so this was also something that I was kind of conflicted with, in the sense that I was like, okay, well, I want to look at Indian culture as part of a wider spectrum of Eastern cultures and integrate that in some way into the classical guitar world. And for me, the idea of doing it from music to music was quite difficult because they're so different.
Yeah.
They've developed for thousands of years across different tonal and harmonic uh, structures, in a way. And some have been able to do that very successfully. For example, I'm thinking of examples like Carlo Domeniconi, who has done incredible work with his compositions in bringing uh, Indian culture, and also, of course, the famous Koyan Baba, which is based on, I think, Turkish culture. Um, and captures that sound world so perfectly. But the figure that really I look up to in many ways is the one that I mentioned, which is Takamitsu,
Mhm.
because in some of his pieces he does a direct translation. For example, um, imitating the sound of Japanese instruments in his works. But I think where he's really at his best is when he's doing it in a more subtle way, presenting a philosophy, or being inspired by an artwork and presenting that through music. And what's interesting is also in his story is he was one that was not initially inspired by Japanese culture. It was John Cage that came to him and made him realize the beauty of Japanese culture, that started him down a path of rediscovering his culture through his music. So for example, when I look at Indian culture, I try and see, like, in India, there's that beautiful ancient culture that is called Indian classical music, and also because of the history and because of the globalization of the world, there's a Western part of India as well. We see it today in very popular things such as the movie industry. The music from there isn't is kind of like 70% Western, 30% Indian classical. I mean, you can recognize, the forms and the structures of, and in fact, it's funny, when I was watching with my mom and my dad, like old school, when I was younger, old school Bollywood movies, you would recognize a lot of themes. And then in the car, sometimes I would say, that's a Mozart symphony. Just That's just been used in an Indian movie. So that element of West entering East has certainly come through. But I'll have to take a look at this John McLaughlin thing, because that would be fascinating to see how he's done it
Yeah, and
with Indian
obviously
culture.
that's coming as a not as a classical guitarist, but as probably one of the best, one of the best kind of plectrum jazz
Mhm.
guitarists ever. you know,
Yeah.
a real genius. So but that's really interesting what you say about Indian movie music, because you know well, a few things to untangle. So we've got, obviously, trying to find a parallel with Takemitsu and his relationship to Japan and Japanese
Mhm.
culture. And it's very interesting what you say about him, that he sort of had it suggested to him from the outside that he should delve into his more native culture for inspiration. Um, uh, uh, but then, so I suppose it's maybe similar with I mean, the composers of the music for Indian films are they Indian generally, or?
I would say yes. For example, there's a big name, A.R. Rahman, who has written, like, you'll have heard of the was he the composer for that? Yes, he was. Slumdog Millionaire.
Yeah.
He composed the music for that, the famous song from that movie, and also he composes a lot of music for Bollywood as well. And he does a wonderful job of mixing the two in a coherent way. Sometimes the issue, and what's interesting about movie music is it has to be for the masses. Often because we're in the classical guitar world, it can be quite niche. And so if it's not entirely coherent for a mass audience, you can get away with it. With movie music, you can't get away with it. It has to be a hit. It has to be popular. Otherwise, you're not going to get booked for the next movie. And he does that through his knowledge, I think, of Western forms and Eastern Indian timbres, using Eastern classical instruments as sounds. Because even today, when I listen to Indian classical music, as I said, you're in awe of the skill and the ability of these musicians that are improvising like jazz musicians. I would say Indian music is closer to jazz in the way it's improvised, but it's also quite meditative. So it takes a lot of energy and focus to understand exactly all of the intricacies that are going on. Of course, that's true with Western music as well, but it depends on the environment upon which you're brought up on, where you will be able to connect with one kind of music or another. It's interesting. I speak to friends that have more of a connection with Indian music because they've listened to more of it in their childhood. Having listened to, the classical guitar hits and symphonic music and piano music, the idea of listening to a 3-hour rag is a different field for me, but which is why I want to, this idea of mixing cultures in the same way that, again, Barrios did. He made Europe understand Paraguayan culture and brought also Europe to Paraguay as well. And so in mixing cultures, it often allows for an education of both in each of their different environments, I would say.
Yeah. What I'd like to explore a little bit now is, how that can be done whilst remaining in some way true to those cultural influences. And I know that's something you're addressing in your research. So I'm thinking someone composing the music for Slumdog Millionaire. To what extent are they taking something that's authentic from Indian music, as opposed to taking something that is what non-Indians think Indian music is?
Absolutely, that's
Does
a
that make sense? It's,
fantastic
it's, it's
question.
the same with Spanish music.
Yeah.
To what extent is a composer trying to present to the world um, what what either they want other people to think Spanish music is, or just to appeal to what they think Spanish music is. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
somebody like Falla came along and in Spain and attempted to do something more authentic.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and I want you to talk about that for a start from the point of view of an Indian composer composing, say, for a film, and then I'd like to get into the issue of European composers tapping in to not just Indian, but various non-European cultures, such as Debussy.
Yeah.
who's been
Yeah.
criticised in some circles for what he's done. I mean, cultural appropriation is
Absolutely.
that's all the rage at the moment. I mean, I've got some ideas about that, but I'm sure yours are more thought through. And so I'd like you to maybe just address all of that. Sorry, that's a long-winded question with lots of layers. So off you go.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a fantastic question because it really, um, and just to describe how my research is structured at the moment. The first section is the looking at pre-existing works that fit the criteria of the research, so works that have been produced that have Eastern cultural influences. The third part is looking at new music, doing arrangements and commissioning composers to write works with Eastern cultural influences. And the second part, which is probably, the meatiest of the thesis, is this one about cultural appropriation and authenticity, because it is, first of all, such an interesting one, and secondly, such a relevant one in our society today, because it's an intersection of philosophy, history, politics, ethics, all of these different things that we have to consider as artists and musicians. And what's interesting is the way in which it's perceived today, the two situations that you gave, one of an Indian composer composing with Western influences, and one of a Western composer composing with either Indian or other non-Western cultural influences, they're perceived differently because of various factors, namely history. And it gets into more controversial matters because of the content of that history. For example, one is colonialism, right? So often you find that it's difficult to, you have to tiptoe sometimes around certain cultures. For example, comedy is a perfect example. In Britain, it's kind of acceptable to make fun of certain cultures, like Western cultures, and do satire of those cultures. And then when it comes to other cultures, it's a bit more difficult. It's a bit less politically correct in that sense. And what's interesting about that is it's primarily down to the history in terms of colonization, because when I was doing this research, they often talk about the power of different cultures, and that was something that was quite unsavory to me when I was reading it. I was like, how can one culture be more powerful than another? Shouldn't all cultures be sort of equal? They have their differences and stuff like that. And what these cultural philosophers say is that actually there is power structures between cultures because of that history. So, for example, a colonized culture is at a lower position than the colonizing culture. And so today, when we discuss these things, we have to be aware of that history. Now, what I find is we have two extremes here. One is that, we are blatantly unaware of history, and we disregard any kind of political correctness, and we cause offense, which is a sort of incredibly, perhaps, hard right way of looking at things. And then there's the other extreme, which I discuss in my as well in the second part, which is a thing known as cancel culture, where one is very easily offended by anything that is perceived as being even a little bit inauthentic. And so because it's not entirely authentic, it causes offense. And because it causes offense, it should therefore be cancelled and censored in culture, in the global market. And what they both present is actually the same thing in different clothing. On one side, there is perhaps the very, very extreme, which is saying this culture is the best and no other culture is better, therefore you only promote this culture. And the other side is saying you can't promote any other culture apart from your own in an authentic way, therefore only stick to your culture. Both are saying just stick to one culture, but they're at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yes,
And
interesting.
so, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And as artists and as as musicians, we have that incredible opportunity to try and find a balance between the two. Because if it goes too far one way, we find that it is causing discomfort to many audiences, and this idea, like you brought up a wonderful example of Debussy and Ravel, and what they called Orientalism at the time. What's interesting about that is, yes, in studies today, in cultural studies today, it's perceived as, by some scholars as something that is causing offense, that isn't done with authenticity, that isn't sincere to what actual Oriental cultures would have been like then. And yet, it wasn't done to offend the culture. It was perhaps done as a way of appreciating that culture. I can give you an example, and one of the main examples that I use in my research is of in Indian culture is food. Because having been brought up in Britain, my perception of Indian cuisine, there are two sides to it. There's the one that I see in India when I go there, and there's the one that I see in Britain when I'm in Britain. And I have to be honest, I like both. I think both are incredible, I would have both anytime. And yet there's a similar discussion about Indian food in Britain. The famous chicken tikka masala or butter chicken. These are dishes that have become popular in Britain, and you hear a lot of commentary about it saying that's not real Indian food, that's British, that's a disgrace, or even the word curry, because curry is seen to perhaps be an overgeneralization of all Indian food, because you would use the word curry in for any Indian dish that you would have with rice or naan. And yet there's also that counter argument, which is, hold on, the Brits aren't necessarily using that to make fun of Indian cuisine. It's quite the opposite. It was voted the best or the national dish of Britain, a couple of years ago, because it was so loved, And yes, maybe it's not quite what tikka masala is in India, but perhaps that's a beautiful thing as well, is an awareness that yes, they're different, but they've created different things in the same way that we would look at art. Debussy and Ravel created symphonic versions of that beautiful painting of that wave done by the Japanese artist who I forget at the moment. But it wasn't supposed to emulate or mirror. It was supposed to be an interpretation, in the same way that when we interpret music, we're not supposed to entirely be authentic, in terms of playing exactly the way Bach would have played. We don't know. And so that's where our artistic personality, our artistic voice can come through, with respect, certainly, to an authenticity that we will be aware of in our studies.
This is fascinating because I like your take on this. I like it very much, actually, and I think what you said about Debussy is absolutely true. Because I mean, if we were to place ourselves in what you described as the far right, and kind of extreme here, Debussy wouldn't have. He would have ignored those influences. He'd have thought them. He wouldn't have thought them worthwhile enough.
Yes.
To delve into. But and at the same time, we can we can acknowledge that what Debussy was absorbing would have been something quite superficial.
Yeah.
I mean, as a genius composer, superficiality doesn't mean that what he absorbed wasn't worth absorbing.
No.
Because somebody of that level of creativity, they just need to hear something, and it sets the creative juices running, and then they create something unique from that. And Debussy was never trying to claim that he wrote, for example, gamelan music,
Yeah.
but just that he heard something in gamelan music which he wanted to incorporate into what he was doing. And then, I mean, it does bring us to the whole question of authenticity. And my worry, I mean, again, there are two extremes. There's the idea that authenticity doesn't matter at all, that it can just be ignored because we can't know it anyway. Well, that to me seems a bit silly, because we're ignoring a potential kind of source of knowledge.
Yeah.
But the other extreme is this idea that we're so hamstrung by authenticity that things can't move forward, or can't, and with the question of authenticity, what do we say is year zero?
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Because things always. I mean, Indian food, I'm sure, developed a lot within within Indian culture before it was then sort of exported or imported, say, to Britain, and then turned into something else again.
Yes.
Exactly when at what point do we say, well, this is authentic and this isn't? It's all it's all part of a sort of development, and
it reminds me of another very, very relevant and certainly ongoing debate today that we find in the classical music world, is that of historically informed performance practice, which you have, a side which is very strongly, vehemently pushing authenticity, in a very academic way. And what I find is, like, because there was an early music department in The Hague, there was a lot of students that I met, wonderful students and teachers that I met there, and learned so much from. And you learn about how the history of everything, and yet, I would think to them, well, they must think that people like us are infidels playing Bach's music on the classical guitar, or Baroque music on a modern instrument. And authenticity, as you say, it's impossible to achieve unless we had a time machine,
mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's again, it's a balance, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
I mean, authenticity in trying to be true to a composer's intentions, and trying to inform ourselves as much as possible, and that is where the research into authentic performance practice is so valuable, because
Yeah.
it can only help us play the music well.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have to have the humility at the end of the day to say, even with all that research, we still don't know for sure. It's and there's a large part of informed, informed artistic choice here.
Yeah.
I mean, using our artistic sense, which we hope is trained and informed, and so what it produces will be, will be good and make sense and worthwhile. But still, at the end of the day, saying, I don't really know.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know how it sounded at that time. I don't know if that's how it was meant to sound. What he heard maybe wasn't what was in his head. I don't know if what is produced now is how it sounded then. I don't know if what is produced now is what it was like in his head. In the end, we don't know. But of course, that's not a reason not to try and find out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So yeah, definitely. I think you're right. There's with all these things, there's a happy medium somewhere. We get insights from all sides, but there is a happy medium in the end. But on that note, we're going to listen to a little bit of your playing. An example. I want you to tell us a bit about it. What it's going to be. I mean, I was fascinated when I found this on YouTube. So what is it? What are the links?
So the links are, it was And it's something that I was very astonished about finding out about, because obviously, on a personal level, my cultural upbringing is that of Scotland and of India. And so uh, everybody knows that Auld Lang Syne is an incredibly popular Scottish melody that is known globally because of New Year, and also because of, in Scotland, because it's such a wonderful poem by Rabbie Burns. Um, and we were talking earlier about Tagore, and you said that Tagore lived nearby where you are at the moment. And it was actually during that time that he was in the UK or in Britain that he came across these poets, and one of them was Rabbie Burns. And he was certainly moved by the poetry of Burns, especially this poem Auld Lang Syne. So he he wrote a Bengali version of the poem called not Full, Purano She Diner Kotha, which basically translates as talk of the old days. So the theme is very similar to Auld Lang Syne. In fact, it's the theme is the same, but the text is slightly different because of Tagore himself as a poet, and also because of the differences in the nuances of Bengali and Scots dialect. So I was incredibly amazed to find that Tagore had made his own version of Auld Lang Syne, and because it's a different text, the melody is slightly different because the words don't work in the same way. So, in fact, the time also changes. The time signature also changes. So, fundamentally, it's like a variation on the original by Rabbie Burns. I'm not aware whether, I only know that Rabbie Burns wrote the text for the poem, but I don't know who wrote the music. I don't know if that was Rabbie Burns himself or if it was an anonymous composer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I should know. But I do know that there are other tunes.
There are other tunes to this text.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah,
At
okay.
least one other that I've come across. So
I see.
yeah, it's interesting. But no, well that's fascinating. So I'd like to put that on now
Of course.
if I can work the work the thing. Uh, so let's hear it now. So wonderful.
Thank
One,
you. Thank
yeah,
you.
and I mean, just beautiful playing as well. I mean, is what you're playing is so interesting. But the playing is so good. You know, the phrasing really very very special. I loved it when I came across it. So
Thank you
congratulations.
very much.
Yeah, it's really great. Well, look, Samrat, that's been really great to talk to you. Really interesting topics, and it's great you're doing so well. Great you're playing so well.
Thank you.
Just to end, could you tell us a little bit about this classical guitar Reach Foundation of India, which
Sure.
sounds pretty special?
Yeah, with pleasure. It's so kind of in tandem with the research and with what I said about my upbringing, I feel certainly very lucky to have been in Glasgow and in Scotland to when pursuing the classical guitar, because the facilities and the teaching there was at such a high level. And the other thing was I had such brilliant role models as a kid to look up to. You know, I had obviously Professor Neve, John Chibe, yourself, Sasha, and Matthew McAllister as well, and these incredible musicians that were doing things. And you know, other aside from the actual learning, I could see that okay, that's what I want to do for a living. You know, I want to have an artistic voice or something like this because I saw individuals like yourself doing that in the real world. Now in India, there is incredible passion for the classical guitar and incredible talent for it as well. I feel one of the unfortunate things is at the moment there's not those role models outside of India or in India that are um, you know there are a few, and those individuals are working with us. And one, for example, is Madhavan Somanathan or Sujit Mukherjee. They're both kind of artistically active. And what we want is to create role models for future generations. And one of the issues that we find is that when it comes to classical guitar education, it's not perceived in the same way as it is in the West, because, first of all, it's a Western art form. And secondly, um, arts isn't funded in the same way. You know, if you are to pursue arts, which is a very, very shocking thing to do in India because there's such a kind of emphasis on academics, it would be Eastern music, Indian music. So it's a niche of a niche. And as a result, those individuals that want to pursue it, the financial obstacles in place are huge, and it doesn't translate well, especially with the currency exchange rates. So what we thought was, okay, let's take away that financial obligation. We are working with students at the moment have who aspire to become classical guitarists, young students, and we don't ask them for any reimbursement in terms of finances. We just ask for their passion so that they can then become role models for the next generation. We give them opportunities. In fact, two of the students who I'm incredibly excited about, you met last November, Shrishti and Pavya, and they're wonderful students. They have such a drive, they have such talent, and they have the right attitude towards it as well. They understand what it means to be in a learning environment. It's not about being the best, but it's about being the best version of oneself. And it's that kind of philosophy that if I'm able to recognize that in an individual, then I don't feel that, I don't feel at all that there's any need for any payment. In fact, I feel like sometimes I should be paying them because I get such pleasure out of the lessons with them. And so what's exciting is that these two individuals, for example, Shrishti will be coming to study in Scotland next year, and Pavia is already looking on doing the same in a couple of years' time. And if those individuals can create those connections and can be tutored abroad as a result of the opportunities that we provide, then that's a success, even if it's just two students. out of however many years. It's like ripples in the water, they spread. And that's something that I'm certainly very, very passionate about. And I love seeing these students and future students as well from India do incredible things, because in many ways the odds are stacked against them in terms of their environment, in terms of the perception of Western classical music in that culture. And so to see them as underdogs perform incredibly is just such a pleasure.
That's wonderful. Yeah, great. No, it sounds like an amazing project, Samrat. So
Thank you.
congratulations. And is that something that people can support? I mean, financially, for example, because obviously you mentioned trying to remove the financial obstacles
Mhm.
that hinder people from pursuing uh, music or the study of
Sure.
music in that way in India. So can people donate? Is that
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've put some fundraisers in place to help kind of provide musical instruments for the students, as well as in the future booking artists for online or live performances and master classes, so that the students are able to get as much information from the world about the classical guitar as possible. And we sort of donation would be deeply appreciated. But these last few years have been just such a pleasure, and the response we've seen from the community within has also been very heartwarming, and also from outside. Even for example, you saying these very warm words, they spur us on to keep on going. Because there is that sense of hope for not just for India, but like I hope that it happens with other cultures where the classical guitar is not quite mainstream yet.
yeah.
Uh, for example, I think of the example of Julian Bream. He did it basically for Britain in a way. He brought so many great composers to the classical guitar, and he promoted all that early music for the classical guitar. Now, of course, we don't perceive him in that way, but he was actually doing that at Segovia with Spain
Mhm.
and the classical guitar globally in a way. So we have these small little pockets of individuals that are doing things in promoting the beauty of the classical guitar.
Wonderful. Well, what we'll do is we'll put a link to the website for the foundation in the description
Thank you.
box. So anyone who does want to check out what's going on there, or does want to look into making some donations, can do
Mhm.
so. Can do so there. That's wonderful, Samrat. Well, it's been really a tremendous pleasure. And just to end, we've got a couple
Yes,
of questions from people on my Patreon page, which I'd like to address.
sure.
So yeah, so the first one is it relates to something we talked about in the first segment of the interview, the different approaches to technique. Um,
Mhm.
how do you reconcile the contradictions that inevitably come up when you're studying with different people, different approaches, and how have you done that in a way that it feeds into your own voice and technique, as the question puts it?
It's a very good question because it comes up all the time
Mhm.
with different teachers. And the approach that I have is whenever I go into a lesson, I am at the beck and call of the teacher, so to say. In terms of whatever the teacher says, I will do my best to try and execute that technique in the lesson, and even outside of the lesson, take a couple of days to try it. Um, 95% of the time, it's an excellent idea, 5% of the time, my hands just don't work that way, or there's something that doesn't fit with me on a technical or an artistic level. But I make that decision after many days or even weeks of having tried to incorporate whatever technique that the teacher at the time has recommended. For example, I can think of a particular example, which is the mazurka appassionata of Barrios. That when the mazurka starts, there's a huge stretch. Now, my professor here, Alexander Ramirez, huge hands like Rachmaninoff, and mine are not so much. And so I was trying for many days to try and get that, and it would always sound a bit dull because my hands weren't that big. So I tried it and tried it and tried it, and then I thought, no, I've got to amend it. Otherwise, it's just trying to do something just for the sake of doing it. So I took out a note, and it just made it so much easier. But that wasn't after having tried many, many different times. So when it comes to different approaches that teachers give, I take both on board, and then I meditate upon them, not in terms of like literal meditation, but I think about them and I practice them. Process them, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And then whichever one I feel most comfortable with, which doesn't include any, which eliminates tension, that's usually the one I go with.
Yeah, good. Well, I think that's really words of wisdom, Samrat, there, because a lot of people just at the first difficulty will say, "Well, that's not for me."
Yeah.
And I think the thing is, when you are absorbing these things and processing them, even when you decide it's not for you, I mean, you've learned so much by doing that. You know, and the other thing is that as a teacher yourself, that's all up here. And it might be right for somebody else.
Yeah.
Do you know? So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a wonderfully positive attitude you've got. It's really magnificent. And just the last question.
Yes, of course.
About the shift in time signature. You mentioned that yourself in the Auld Lang Syne that you played, and so it just to clarify, was that to accommodate the words?
Actually, on YouTube or on any other streaming platform, if you look at the original versions of the Bengali version of Purano Sediner Kotha, it's actually also in 6/8. So in many ways, I think Tagore had written. What's interesting about Tagore is he didn't write with Western notation. He wrote with a notation that is very specific to Bengali music or Hindustani music, which was called, it's called Chorolipi. And that kind of notation rhythmically is different. It's kind of like lute tablature. There's a lot more freedom with it. Now, where the stresses of the beats and the words were falling they indicate that it was a compound time rather than a simple time signature, which is why it took this 6/8 form. Technically you could see it as also simple time with just triplets. It could also be a possible thing. The reason why I went with the compound time was because all of the other original versions of Purano Sediner Kotha that I'd heard were originally in 6/8, and I thought it was also quite a nice contrast to the 4/4. In fact, with the 4/4, I wanted to have a more kind of Elgarian feel with a choral kind of arrangement, and so to contrast that, the 6/8 is quite nice because it's more dance-like in a way.
No, it's really good. It's really superb. It really is. Yeah. So anyway, that's great. I'll of course link to that YouTube clip in the description box so that people can go and listen again. Absolutely wonderful. Well, I mean, I think we're probably out of time. So
yes.
Thanks so much, Samrat, for being the first guest on Sounding Out. I think it was a good choice, and another thing is that I do not for 1 second regret you getting those prizes 2 years in a row. I mean, you deserved them then, and you're proving yourself now
Thank you.
in many ways. For the listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you do want to support these podcasts, you can do so following the links below to my Patreon page. If you want for something more regular, there's a lot of guitar-related stuff there, or in a one-off way at Buy Me a Coffee. If you're not able to do so, don't worry at all, but do like and subscribe. And you can also click the notify me button for future episodes. But until next time, thanks again, Samrat, and thanks for listening, and all the best.